Hi, I'm Oliver. I make electronic music as Mentat, and this is a breakdown of my track June, which is out now on Traum Schallplatten. So this is the original version of June. It started off as a modular jam, and I was just playing around with different ways of making sounds and melodies, and I ended up with this kind of 4.5 minute track. Pretty ambient. I haven't got any drums set up in the modular at the moment, so it was just the melodies and the bass and so on, plus some chords that I added through MIDI. So the first part that I did was this kind of pluck sound, and for that I used the Mutable Instruments plucks, and I used the string algorithm on here. This is just an oscillator, and it's got various different modes you can use, but this one just emulates a kind of plucked string. And I had a few bits of modulation kind of going into that to change the sound, but nothing too complicated. But the actual melodies themselves and the sequences were coming from this other Mutable Instruments module, which is Marbles. And Marbles is a random sampler, and it can create all sorts of random kind of outputs, including quite musical melodies and outputs. So I set this up with just a random sequence, and I was just tweaking these knobs, and I got to a point where there was something I quite liked, so you can freeze that, and then you can change around some of the settings, the length and so on, and just get it to be outputting something that's interesting and sort of melodic. Then the next part on here was the bass line, and for that bass line I actually used the No Coast, Make Noise No Coast, which is a kind of West Coast style synth, and that was running from one of the other channels from Marbles, so everything that was happening was sort of musically related to what was going on in the plucks. So consequently it's quite random and quite weird, but for this sort of ambient jam I thought that worked quite well, and I tamed it a little bit by bringing down the dynamics to just keep the frequencies really low, and so it sounds sort of interesting but not too harsh, which this synth can often end up a little bit harsh. Then over the top of all of that I had that kind of sawtooth melody, very simple melody that you can hear, and that came from the Metropolis. It was just literally 2 notes repeating over and over, very simple, and that was playing this analog oscillator going into a filter, and then I had some very slow modulation on that was just automatically bringing it up and bringing it down. So then the other part that I used was Flow Motion synth, this Waves FM synth, and the parts were kind of suggesting to me a sort of Aphex Twin vibe, so I thought I'd go with that and get some FM style chords going, or pads. So I think this was started off as a preset, but I'm sure I tweaked it quite a bit, as I normally do, and then I just figured out some chords that would work over the top, and pretty loosely sort of jammed them over them, playing on the MIDI keyboard and triggering that synth, and then that came up with this sort of chord sequence. So that was the original modular jam, which I thought was quite a nice ambient track, but after a while I thought, well, maybe I could do something else with this and turn it into more of a full track. So this is the project for the full version of June, which I turned into the full track. And the first thing I did for this was add in some drums. So I knew I wanted to make it more of a kind of a club track. So I created some drums, and I usually do that using Native Instruments Machine. So I can program stuff on the hardware and program up a bunch of patterns, and then trigger those patterns from Ableton Live. So I can still keep tweaking and changing them, but I've got them moving through the different sequences, and I usually run them out onto different channels from all the different outputs as well, so I can do things like EQ and compress and add plugins. You can do that within Machine, but I just prefer to do it here because when I'm mixing, then I've got all of my mixing details on one page. So then I looked at the plucks, and when I turned this into a full track, They were really quite random and a little bit all over the place, which sort of worked for the ambient jam, but I wanted it to have a bit more of a hook. So I went through them all and I chopped out a few particular phrases which I thought worked together. And I made this main phrase with 3 different clips from different parts of the recording. And I had that bit come in a few times at different points in the track, with a few other variations as well. And then there are some long stretches too where it's just playing the sort of random algorithmically generated stuff so that it meanders around but then still comes back to the main theme. So in a similar way, I chopped up the bass a bit as well. I separated it out onto 2 channels so I could just, for mixing really, so I could tune the high end and make that cut through as well as that super deep low. But then there were some sections where I didn't want that kind of wiggling bass all over the place. I just wanted a sort of more of a groove going on. So I just chopped out, it's from the same recording, 1 section. I played with a lot of different sections and then I found one that I thought worked quite well and fitted with the drums. So then between that bass and the plucks, I built out the structure with the drums. I had the sawtooth bits playing fairly similar to where they were in the original drum. But when I went to build it up at the beginning, it really needed something else. So I set up these, what I called intro plucks, which were just a really small segment of a very quiet part of the plucks track, and I filtered this and tweaked it a bit and also automated the filter so it comes in and out. So that was quite good to get the track going, get it started, but it needed something else as well. So I went back onto my modular synth and I messed around with just trying to make as weird sounds as I could really, and came up with this one, which it was doing much the same thing, but I just looped it up into a very short loop, and I've got that going through a filter as well, so it's being automated so that it sort of rises and falls in the background. So I had a nice interplay between those plucks and that sound to just build up the track and bring it in before it drops down into the break and brings in the plucks. So that was most of the track. I added a few effects and sort of fills, crashes and things here and there. I added in some background voice samples which you can hardly hear, but I quite like the way that they just sort of murmur away in the background, especially when you're listening to it on headphones. And then I arranged the whole track and spent a while mixing it down. But it's ended up as quite a simple track as far as my arrangements go, 22 channels, which is not that much. For my tracks, usually end up with quite a few more, but I like the simplicity and I like the way that I was able to take that improvised and also randomly generated modular jam and cut bits out of it and arrange it and take the best bits and turn it into a full track. I hope that was a useful breakdown of how I made that modular jam and then turned it into a full track. If you've got any more questions, feel free to ask them in the comments and I'll check and reply. The track's out now on Traum Schallplatten. You can stream, download from all the usual places. You can find links for that at mentataudio.com/June.